Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. In this video, I would like to talk a little bit about my favorite genre, I guess, of tarot and oracle decks, why I love them, how I read with them, and other ways that I work with them as well. For the purpose of this video, I'm calling these decks place-based tarot and oracle decks. So folks who watch my channel will know that my favorite deck is the Naturescapes Tarot by Tina, Queen of Wands. This is a deck that is on Make playing cards. And so I was initially going to talk about these decks in terms of landscape decks, since of course this particular deck is photography featuring landscapes. But I ended up broadening a little bit to think about these decks as place-based decks, because a number of the decks that I'm going to show, there are 5 including this one, have interior scenes as well, have imagery of architecture, statues, the interiors of rooms, and different kind of monuments and things like this. So they're not, strictly speaking, all landscape decks exclusively, but I think that they form a bit of a group in my mind anyway, such that I work with them in somewhat similar ways. And I think that these decks for me are really approachable to work with, but I also feel like they're a kind of deck that might at first glance seem difficult to work with insofar as they do not clearly reflect a major tarot system. So they're not going to be clearly Smith-Waite or clearly Marseille style for folks who have learned in those ways. You know, so they call for somewhat different reading styles, I think. And so that's why I wanted to talk about them and share how I go about that. So I'll start with just a couple of decks that fall into this category, but I will also mention that I feel like in order to kind of think about tarot or oracle in a kind of place-based way, you know, you don't need to go out and buy a new deck like this, though you certainly could, because a lot of decks have imagery that has, you know, lots of backgrounds, and if there's people in the deck, the people are in a room or out in a space, you know, doing something. So you can kind of think about some of these ways of reading that I'm going to talk about in reference to that as well. And so hopefully this is interesting or helpful. So to just share a couple of the decks, I've shown this one, this is the back, is Naturescapes by Tina, Queen of Wands. She has a second deck, which I've also grouped into this category. Actually, she has 3 decks. She also has a cat deck. But this one would also be a place-based deck in my view. And this is the Tarot of Architectural Objects. So this deck has doorways for wands, fountains and statues for cups, windows for swords, and if I can find one here, staircases for pentacles. So as the name suggests, you know, architectural objects. Architecture is central to all of the cards. Many of the cards are landscape, they're outdoors, but not all. Beautiful sun card. And so this one to me is certainly a place-based tarot deck as well. I also have one oracle deck in the bunch, and this is one of my favorite oracle decks, and one of the earliest oracle decks to join my collection, actually. This is the Life Path cards. This is the back of the deck. By Kristen of OTM Academy, who is the creator of many amazing decks. And the Life Path cards feature pictures of paths, some of which are indoor, some of which are outdoor. Definitely a place-based deck. And I'll link below if I remember. Kristen has a Life Path Cards course that goes along with this deck. And it is fantastic. It is free. And I would say that it's worth a look whether you have this particular deck or not. The Life Path Cards course has different spread prompts and ways of thinking about being on these different paths. It has a really good explanation of path working meditation, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. It has some suggestions for things like making vision boards and all kinds of activities designed to work with this particular deck, but that I think could be worked with, particularly the spreads, with many other decks, but perhaps particularly these kinds of place-based decks. So I will link that one below for the Life Path cards. I would also include in this category a deck probably many folks are familiar with, which is the Augenblick Tarot by Shannon Loftus. I believe that now there is going to be a rectangular version of this deck, like a more traditionally tarot-sized version of this deck, but the one that I have is square. And it is archival images. And so there's a mix in here of architectural images, of landscape images, of statues, all different. And it's not a deck without people. There are people, for example, here in the King of Wands, but people are not the focus in this deck. They're mostly smaller and kind of in the midground or background where they are present. So that's the Augenblick Tarot. And then the last one I included, may or may not be one that the folks would think about in the same way, but I kind of do. And that one is the Majestic Earth Tarot by J.D. Hildegard Hinkle. There's the bottom of the box. I guess not that recently now, got this as a seconds and was very happy with that. So this deck features artwork from the Hudson River School, Luminism, European Romanticism, Russian Realism, and the American West. So unlike the other four, this one is a bit different in that it is not photographs. It is paintings. But they are, in many cases, landscape paintings. I don't like that the queens are called creatures. The only thing about this renames that I don't care for. But this one has a lot of landscape scenes in it as well. It has a lot of kind of architectural scenes in it as well. So for me, while it is not a photograph deck like the others, I do think it can be read in a lot of similar ways, and I work with it in a lot of similar ways, so I thought that I would include that one as well. So, why do I love these decks so much? There's a lot of reasons that I love these decks so much. Inevitably, part of why I love landscape and place-based decks so much has to do with, having a pantheist outlook and seeing sacredness in scenes that look like this, right? Having a very much nature-based or earth-based practice and connecting to the natural environment and building a relationship with the natural environment that I'm in being a big part of my practice, then cards with imagery like these, of course, appeal to me. I like nature imagery for artwork in my house too, you know. And I can't always be outside as much as I would like. I can't, you know, necessarily explore everywhere that I would like to explore. I have some health issues that make me extremely sensitive to cold. I react very badly to cold. And for folks who don't know, I live in central Ontario, which means there are parts of the year where I'm stuck indoors a lot. So having cards like this to explore is really beneficial for me at those times. And I've shared, you know, when I got this deck, Naturescapes Tarot, was right, I think near the beginning of things being locked down at the start of the pandemic, and having, you know, these images to step into and explore while I was feeling really stuck in the house and unable to go a lot of places was really helpful for me in that way. Sorry if I keep, you know, doing, it's a very hot day and I don't have air conditioning, so I'm aware that I'm like shiny and stuff. But doing my best. So I like that these decks can bring me places that I can't necessarily go. I feel like inspired to learn about new places with decks like this, particularly when, and you know, and a lot of these decks do, when the creator includes a guidebook with some details about where each picture was taken or where each painting was done in the case of the Majestic Earth, and the actual place that's being depicted, right? Because that, I think, layers another aspect of meaning onto the card. So for example, the Strength card here in the Naturescapes depicts Machu Picchu, and learning about Machu Picchu being a fortification, right? Like a citadel, a walled city built for protection. In the context of the Strength card, that lends to the reading, and it also means, you know, you're learning about a new place, which I think is great. I like landscape decks as well because I feel like they are almost inherently completely neutral. You can't really have a bad landscape, right? Maybe if it was covered in garbage or something, that would be bad, but I feel like it doesn't lend itself to reading any particular card in necessarily particularly positive or negative ways. Certainly, you know, in the life path cards, you might not choose this path to be a path that you would love to be on, but I think that in a real sense, there's not a way for one landscape or one place, as they're depicted in these kinds of decks, to be better or worse than any other in any inherent way. You know, for me being claustrophobic, this one is more challenging, but it's not bad, right? Like there's no reason that this would be a bad card, or that like this one would be a good card or anything like this, right? None of them are better than the other. And similarly, they lend themselves, I think, to understandings that are not hierarchical. So to take their tarot example, when the imagery is architectural, like in this tarot of architectural objects, something like the court cards are still distinct because they have different images, but it's hard to say that one is more advanced than the other, or one is more fully developed than the other, or one is more in charge of the other, in terms of the court structure, right? That one is more of a leader than the other, right? It takes all of that for me out, and that's not going to necessarily appeal to everybody, but for me, I really like the fact that is taken out. I also like the ways in which these decks for me bring up reactions that are very sensory. So looking at an image like this. You know, I might feel a particular temperature, or, you know, even kind of sounds and smells and things start to come to mind, for me at least, when I see these kinds of landscapes or spaces. And that, I think, can lend to interpretation. And I mentioned that I think that these decks are very approachable in a way. And part of why I think that is that they're not decks that have a whole bunch of esoteric symbolism that you have to kind of book study, right? They're not steeped in these systems, right, that have a lot of symbolism that you have to kind of learn the significance of, or maybe you just decide that you don't want to learn the symbolism of, but there's none of that there, right? There's not really layers upon layers of things like astrology in a deck like this, which maybe, you know, reading layers of astrology on top of tarot is something that you really enjoy, and that's totally fine, and I do at times as well. But in terms of working with a new deck, you know, and not having that basis, I think that it can sometimes be a barrier, and these decks don't have that. And finally, I feel like these kinds of images, these kinds of decks, are very open-ended in terms of how they could be interpreted, right? So they don't, in their imagery, insist on a very narrow meaning of a card. And what I mean by that, for example, is that I know for some folks, and including me, who read both Smith-Waite and kind of Pip style or Marseille style decks, a card like the Three of Swords in the Smith-Waite can feel very limiting. Because if you're someone who reads with, say, a numerology plus element approach to understanding the minors, which I do when I'm reading Pips or Marseille style, I think about, okay, it's a 3 and it's swords. Swords have to do with intellect, you know, and I come to meanings based on that. Then having a sword being transected by, a heart being transected by a bunch of swords feels like a really strong insistence on reading that 3 plus the air suit in a very specific and probably not very positive way. That can feel restrictive. Whereas, you know, a card like this does not have that kind of specificity to it in a way, which I quite like, though they will inevitably, you know, bring up associations. This is, I can't remember the name of this building, but this building was in Blade Runner. It's in Los Angeles, so I always think of that when I get this card. So those are some things that I really like about these kinds of decks and why I enjoy working with them. So that was the next bit that I wanted to talk about. In terms of when I am reading a deck like this, reading a tarot deck like this, I'll set aside the one oracle for now and just talk about tarot. I like to think about initial first impressions when a card appears. What I would perhaps feel like if I found myself in the place that is depicted. You know, is it a place that is comfortable? Why might I be there? What might I want to do when I'm there? How do I feel being surrounded by this environment? Am I happy there? And so on. And that's a good place to start. You know, does this feel familiar? Does it feel daunting? Does it feel intimidating? Does it feel ominous in some way? Do I want to leave? right? I like to think about the terrain in the card. And here I'm thinking more of decks like this one where most of the cards are outdoors. You know, thinking about the terrain in the card is like, is this terrain smooth? Is this a place that is easy to navigate? You know, is this a place that feels welcoming? Maybe even nostalgic. And where am I in it? Do I have a bird's eye view of a place? Another bird's eye view. Am I close? Am I far? You know, and what's happening there? And I think to get to know decks like this, it can be helpful to compare cards. Like I put aside to look at the moon and the sun in Naturescapes Tarot, right? Again, you know, thinking about kind of hierarchies and meanings and that trajectories of the majors. I don't read one of these cards or one of these images as better than the other. I don't read one of these cards as necessarily even more desirable than the other, or even one that I would rather necessarily be in, but they certainly evoke very different feelings, these two images, right? One is very misty. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty in this one. There's no clear way forward in this card. It's illuminated, but not fully. It, I think, invites some imagination. To me, it almost looks like a fantasy landscape in some ways, whereas the sun card, you know, it's much more illuminated. There's a very clear path. There's very little ambiguity here, right? Everything is lined up in this one. Everything is visible. And it feels like a very happy card to me. And you can find hints, I think, in a lot of these decks because, of course, you know, folks are creating these decks who have familiarity with tarot and with tarot symbolism from systems like the Smith's Waite. So you can find elements of it in some of the cards, like this Four of Cups, right? You have an unmoving stone there with a lot of water going on around it. But the stone is unyielding and is not going to move, even if there might be some pressure exerting on it to move. It is saying, no, I'm going to be still for a little bit, right? The Five of Cups has what maybe feels like a bit of a desolate feeling in the foreground, but in the background, there's a rainbow, which can only be positive, right? I like to think about in these cards what, you know, moving around in them would feel like. And this card is an example, the Eight of Swords. Feels like there's no obvious path here. It feels like some work is going to be needed to figure out the best way to move from this spot, if you want to move from this spot. But there's nothing about this spot that is necessarily a bad spot to be either. You know, so it can give lots of these thoughts that I think do parallel with decks and other systems, right? But without such a specific image, which I like. And similarly, with a deck that is a more of an indoor space, we'll say, like the Augenblick has some more indoor spaces, right? You You can think about the significance of the space, particularly if you know where the photo was taken. You know, what is the space used for? And what might be the significance of some of the objects in the space? Why might they be there? What can one do in this space? Why might one go to this space? Why might one want to be there? Why is it designed the way it is? You know, what is the significance of that? And there's another Four of Cups as a comparison. I really like both of these Fours of Cups. There's a sense of stillness in this one as well. And a technique I think that can be interesting to read with these decks is when reading with something like a past, present, future spread, or even something like a Celtic cross that has a bit of that sense of a past, present, future within it, and a trajectory, right? Or you know, just a more free-form kind of grid of cards, with cards on the left being, you know, a bit more associated with the past and cards on the right being a bit more associated with the future. You can think about what it would be like to move from one space to the next with a deck like this, right? Like if you have, I don't know, something like this in a past position, if we're reading a spread with this Oracle deck, which you absolutely can, something like this in the past position, but then you end up with something like this one in the future position, I think that it can be interesting to think about, okay, well, what does it feel like to go from this to this, right? This one is a lot more illuminated. This one has, you know, you can see more of where you're going, certainly. This one is a lot straighter. This one curves at the bottom. I don't know if you can actually see that because it's pretty dark, but it very clearly curves at the bottom, so you don't know what's coming up. And then here, I think in a much greater sense you do, but this could also be quite claustrophobic for someone potentially. You know, with the trees on either side, this could feel limiting. There's not really a place to turn on this path either. So there's lots of things to consider when working with these kinds of decks, even when they don't have the familiar, say, Smith-Waite symbolism or the familiar pip symbolism of a particular number of a suit item. There's so much to dive into that I think is really fun to explore. And there's a few other ways, I think, to work with these decks that you know, maybe are not specific to place-based decks, they're not specific to landscape decks, but that I feel like these styles of decks really lend themselves to. And this is another reason that I like them so much. And one of those is what I'll call pathworking meditation. I will say that the word pathworking and pathworking meditation has a couple of different definitions depending on the context in which it's being used. There are more specific applications of pathworking that have to do with the tree of life, for example. But here I'm talking about pathworking in a sense of stepping into an image and meditatively exploring what it feels like to be inside that image, right? What the sensory experience is like, what kind of feelings that evokes, who might be there, you know, with what kind of message for you. Which I find is a really great way of meditating for me personally. I also like working with these kinds of decks in a more face-up kind of a way. So choosing an image that might, to me, well represent something I'm feeling currently about a situation, and then working through, journaling through why that is, right? Why might it be that that this card of all the ones in the deck is the one that seems to represent my scenario, right? What about it does that? And then maybe also choosing one that would represent the scenario that I would prefer to find myself in. Maybe I would prefer to find myself here, and this one might symbolize, I'm just picking these, at random as an example, but if this best encapsulates how I want to feel or where I want to be with a particular issue, but where I am currently at with that issue feels like this, that's a really good journaling exploration, I think, right? Or if I might represent my desired future in a particular area, relationship, say, with an image like this one, why is that? And I think that can be a really good journaling exercise. I think also these kinds of different images make really good, like altar cards or display cards. You can pick one and have it out that represents something that you want to manifest. You could use something like these cards in spell work in that way. I have used, there's some extra cards. I've got a lot of stuff on the desk and I'm trying to not knock stuff off. The Majestic Earth Tarot comes with some extra cards to represent elements. So it has, this card is air. They have the glyphs there, so you can tell which one is which, and it's fairly obvious. Air, fire, water, earth. This big mountain, and spirit. So I've used these cards to represent those elements on my reading table or in my space, for various things. And I think that, place-based tarot and oracle decks can work really well for those kinds of uses as well. So this is just my ramble about why I love place-based and landscape tarot and oracle decks so much. Do you love these decks? Do you have any decks that you would put in this kind of category? And if so, what are some of the ways that you work with them that, that I haven't mentioned or that I have mentioned? Feel free to share in the comments. I would love to chat about that. And until the next time, I wish you all a great day. See you all soon. Bye.